Hello everyone, this is part 33 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of 6 Parts, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Fu masked her confusion well as she ran across the tiled roofs of the small fishing village. It was a comparatively small place when compared to a large city-like village such as Konoha, but it was still a big place, especially to find someone in. However, she had been expecting the signs of a fight. After all, Jinchuriki fights were rarely contained to one place and the damage was never minimal. Earlier, as they had raced through the trees, she had felt a large blast of potent Bayu chakra, more than she had ever felt than ever before, even from herself, meaning Utakata had for some reason gone into a full, six-tailed Bayu state. However, there was no sign of that now. In fact, the air was still and calm, too calm. Nobody would have been prepared for when the tiles beneath their feet suddenly turned white, giving Fu and the others only moments to jump away on instinct alone before they exploded into a massive conflagration of heat and flame. However, the mint-haired Jinchuriki found that as soon as she touched down on the adjacent roof, the exact same thing happened, rendering her off balance and overwhelmed as she jumped from rooftop to rooftop, having them all explode after her. Finally, she ran out of space and was forced to jump high into the air to avoid a final, much larger blast that she was caught on the edge of, sending her flying through the air uncontrollably. She impacted roughly with the ground, creating a small trench through the loose soil with her body before rolling to a stop. She picked herself up slowly, orange eyes darting about in preparation for another ambush. However, she only saw Haku, racing down the street towards her. His kimono was a little singed, but otherwise he looked okay as he skidded to a stop next to her. Fu, you're okay. What was that back there? I lost track of Tayuya in the blast. Fu's eyes continued to dart about as she tried to find the location of their attacker. Luckily, she didn't have to search too far before she spotted a smirking blonde man standing atop a nearby building, red clouds decorating his black cloak. Or you survived. Sasori-Dana's not going to be pleased if I keep him too long. Couldn't you just stick me to my art like good little kids? Fu loosened off her shoulders, trying to analyze what she knew about this man to find a name. She recognized the style as Explosion Release, a very rare Kekkei Genkai from a Wagakure. However, his headband was S. She didn't remember there being a missing nin of his description before she ran away with Naruto. Her information was becoming more and more out of date. She really needed to get her hands on a current bingo book. Haku, this man uses explosions. The villagers here will be at risk, so try to find Tayuya if you can and get him to safety. I will draw him away from this place if I can. Haku hesitated for a moment as he was loath to leave his friend to face such an obviously powerful opponent. However, the tone in her voice gave him pause. He had heard that same tone before, from Naruto. It spoke of confidence and resolve, and one just couldn't argue against it. Right. With that, the last Yuki dashed off to find their wayward redhead while Fu turned her full attention on the former Iwa bomber who was looking at her amusedly, hands stuck into his cloak. It gave her a little more time to analyze him for any exploitable weaknesses. A long blonde bang hung down over one eye, but it didn't appear to hinder his sight, and anything else was concealed beneath the bulky, shapeless cloak. Oh, you'll lead me away, huh? The man grinned as the sound of large flapping wings appeared behind him, just as an enormous white bird that appeared to be made of clay of some sort ascended behind him. How are you going to do that if you can't even reach me? The blonde bomber jumped backwards onto the bird's back, landing in a three-point stance before languidly straightening up. Fu's eyes widened when she realized a limp form as being carried in the doughy tail of the bird, no doubt the Rokubi Jinchuriki, Utakata. So all I have to do is catch you. Fu's voice was calm and level as she gazed up at the now airborne bomber, just the smallest hints of amusement slipping through her stoic facade. In an instant, two large, insectoid wings seemed to unfurl as if out of thin air from her back, each a brilliant yellow that gradiated to red towards the tips. Far from the extensions of her chakra cloak that they were before, these wings seemed real, as if they had always been a part of Fu. She proved just how real they were as she began to lift off the ground, wings beating furiously behind her in an orange blur of motion. The bomber was grinning as he flew off to help his partner wrap up with the Kyuubi Jinchuriki so they could make a quick getaway with the Rokubi. It was only reflex honed from hundreds of battles and intense training that told him to bank swiftly to the left, narrowly missing the spinning blur that rocketed past him like a human bullet. The spinning object paused in the air, gracefully unraveling to reveal Fu, hovering there like it was the most natural thing in the world. You may not leave, your opponent is me. However, far from the reaction she had been expecting, the Uenuke Nin's grin only widened as the bird came to a likewise stop in mid-air, hovering there on powerful downward beats of its wings. Well, green hair, orange eyes, insect wings. So that's where the Nanabe container went, Sasori Dana will be pleased if we manage to bring back 2 Jinchuriki with us. He seemed to nod to himself as if deliberating something in his mind before grinning even further as he gazed up at Fu. Alright Nanabe, I'll face you, my name is Deodara. Remember it because it's my art that will be imprinted on your retinas in your very last moments, because true art is an explosion. Fuu's eyes widened when she felt something behind her, her wings folding inwards on instinct to allow her to swiftly drop down. Katsu. It was just in time too as Deodara formed a half-tiger seal and the much smaller white clay birds that had been sneaking up behind Fu detonated into successive blasts of heat and flame. Fu was just out of their blast radius though, spinning out of her dive to soar back up towards Deodara, wings beating furiously as she darted left and right erratically like a dragonfly. However, the blonde bomber was prepared for her, hands re-emerging from his cloak as he threw out a few more of the little living sculptures. A puff of smoke later and they had enlarged into 2 medium-sized birds with 4 wings that immediately matched her speed as they rocketed towards her. Fu remained emotionless as she placed her own hands into the tiger seal, sucking in a large breath before breathing out a huge cloud of bright, sparkling dust that she proceeded to fly straight into, blocking her and the explosive birds from Deodara's view. The bomber covered one eye and tried to spot her with the special device he had over his left eye, but it was useless. The dust cloud only reflected the light back at him, blinding him if he looked for too long. Katsu. In a last-ditch attempt to get her, Deodara simply detonated the clay birds within the cloud, the explosion managing to disperse the optical ninjutsu to reveal Fu had vanished. Deodara's eyes widened as he spun around, ducking in time to avoid a spinning axe kick that speed was maximized by the girl dropping hundreds of feet at him. Instead, her foot hit the bird he was standing on, time pausing for a moment as the momentum carried through the sculpture before the great bird went plummeting down to the ground. If it had been alive, its spine would have been instantly cracked by the insane maneuver. Deodara watched from his fall as Fu stayed hovering in the sky, staring dispassionately down at him. He hated that look. It was the same one Itachi always gave him, taunting him with their so-called superiority. He would show them. A slightly crazed grin erupted on his face as his hands once again came up into the half-tiger seal. Fu only had time to look down in shock and see the small white spiders that were suddenly covering her body, Deodara having planted them there when he ducked from her kick, before they detonated. The flash illuminated the sky even in the daylight, lighting up Deodara's manic grin. However, it was immediately replaced by a frown when no limp, scorched body fell from the smoke cloud. Confusion, then realization marred his features when the dust cleared to reveal a smaller white cloud of smoke at its center. Hey, shadow clones, you're pretty good for a Jinchuriki. In another burst of smoke, another large bird appeared to catch him from his fall, allowing him to look around to try and spot his hidden opponent. He spotted her flying furiously away from him, the limp form of Utakata carried in her arms so that she could get him somewhere safe. Deodara nodded his head approvingly at his opponent's tactics as his bird raced after them, surprisingly fast for its size and the heavy material it was made from. Well Nanabe, you've been doing pretty well against my Shi-1, but let's up the game a notch, How about my Shi-Su? As Fu continued to fly in the opposite direction of the mad bomber, her orange eyes widened when the color on the limp form of the Rokubi Jinchuriki began to fade into a familiar, doughy white. She immediately tried to drop the fake, but the sticky clay suddenly tried to engulf her, hardening around her body in an attempt to catch her mid-flight. Katsu. Deodara had to shield his eyes from the powerful explosion, grinning all the while. It had been a long time since he faced an opponent strong enough to warrant the use of the next step in his art. However, his grin slowly faded from his face as the smoke from the blast diffused into the air. Right at the center, where he was hoping to see at least a defeated, or at least battered and singed Fu, was a yellowy-red cocoon formed by the girl's wings. It completely enveloped her body, protecting her from the blast even at such a close range. She didn't know anything stronger than the scales on the Nanabe's wings after all. Slowly it unfurled to reveal she now had 4 of the quickly beating extra appendages, each working in harmony to keep her aloft, making her seem even more like a dragonfly. She had to be careful now though, this was the limit of her control over the partial transformation. No. Deodara growled as he pressed his hands together. For the first time Fu noticed with a small grimace of disgust that the man had hands in each of his palms, complete with teeth and tongues. Those mouths were now swapping the clay between them as they chewed it up before spitting it out in the visage of a miniature dragon. It didn't stay miniature for long though, as it expanded in a massive cloud of smoke with Deodara standing proudly on its head. You haven't seen anything of my art yet. Fu did her best to ignore the seemingly mad ramblings of the bomber while keeping an eye on him as she scanned the surroundings for any sign of the missing Rokubi Jinchuriki. She spotted him in the slowly dissolving body of Deodara's original mount that she had kicked out of the sky. However, as soon as she spotted him, she noticed something off about his body. It was beginning to radiate Bayu chakra at an alarming rate. Even from this distance she was able to see as the thin man's eyes snapped open, revealing them to be soulless and completely black. Even Deodara turned as the oppressive weight of the Rokubi's chakra fell on him full force. Ah, Sasori Dana's going to be annoyed with me, The last senbon fell to the ground with a muted clink of metal on earth, creating a small pile of them just in front of Naruto, halted by some invisible border 2 meters out from his feet. Puppeteer and monk stared at one another. Naruto, no longer seeing the reason to hide his Rinnegan, allowed his ringed eyes to meet with Sasori's as the two stared the other down. How could you do that to yourself? Sasori's face remained impassive as he gazed at the blonde whose eyes met darting over his body disbelievingly. Oh, so you see it then? Naruto did. He saw everything with sickening detail. Just like with his other puppets, Sasori was coated by a thin film of chakra, hiding everything inside him. The man had turned himself into a puppet. Isn't it beautiful? An immortal, unaging body that doesn't feel pain and I can modify, improve and perfect at my leisure. A small smirk made its way onto the Sunan Yukinin's face as he looked down, some of his red spiky hair falling across his eyes as he sighed in amusement. I'm afraid I lied to you. You see, you will not be my masterpiece. I have already constructed my masterpiece of puppetry. And it is me. Sasori cast his Akatsuki cloak aside, revealing his puppet body in all its glory. Had he not have had segmented joints and an unnaturally shiny luster to his skin, he probably would have been considered handsome in a Bishonen way. He looked to be around 16, although the body itself made determining his age impossible. There was some kind of coil embedded in his stomach that looked to be a thick metal rope wound around a spool like some cheap mockery of intestines. However, Naruto knew this was no ordinary puppet. It was no trick to fool him into a false sense of security by a clever puppeteer. Where Sasori's heart would be was a strange cylindrical object embedded in his sea that's fleshy appearance clashed with the shiny aesthetic of the rest of his body. It was imprinted with the kanji for scorpion. However, its appearance meant little compared to what it represented. Naruto could see it all with his Rinnegan. It was the source of the man's chakra, an entire chakra circulatory system, down to the coils, compressed into a tiny space and used to power this abomination of a puppet. How many attempts did it take you to successfully compress down an entire chakra system? How many people did you kill on your path to this immortality? Sasori shrugged, allowing Naruto to see how the individual joints slid and moved about one another just as a real human body would do. While the practice itself was hideous, there was no denying the expert craftsmanship that actually went into this puppet body. Not just anyone could have made such a puppet. Unfortunately, progress is paved with little s, but the end result was well worth it. Naruto's hand clenched around his shakuju subconsciously. It's funny how many people there like you that are so accepting of s, as long as they aren't the one who actually s something. What you call s, I call making someone else suffer in your place. Sasori waved a hand at the blonde absently. That may be, but it's ultimately irrelevant. Now, how about I introduce you to a very special puppet of mine? He'll be the one you replace as the pride of my collection, but for now he will suffice. Sasori pulled out a scroll that was one of 4 mounted on his back, unfurling it to reveal a large kanji for third. Naruto was about to reach out and pull it to him with a Banshu tenon, but he was too late. In a puff of smoke, Sasori had managed to summon the puppet. Say hello to the Sandaime Kazekage of Sunagakure no Sato. Naruto's eyes widened at that. He might not have had the expansive knowledge of shinobi that Fu did, but even he knew the significance of Suna's supposedly most powerful kage. His disappearance had instigated the Third Shinobi World War as Suna moved into Iwa's territory in attempts to find him, thinking it to be AK. Well, it seemed they were right, it just hadn't been Iwagakure who took him. I will show you why he was considered the most powerful Kazekage Suna has ever seen. The puppet itself seemed rather plain, wearing a ragged grey cloak that concealed much of its body with messy black hair and a regal, stoic face. The only thing indicating it was even a puppet was the fact its mouth seemed connected to the rest of its face via a segment. Suddenly that segmented mouth opened up far too much to ever be considered normal as it began to release copious amounts of tiny iron filings that quickly formed into a cloud in front of it. A compartment in its sea opened up, releasing a pulse of chakra that immediately had the iron sand jumping to the puppeteer's command. Jiten, Satetsu Shiga. The iron sand suddenly whirled into a vaguely circular shield before the puppeteer and his minion before bulging out. Faster than most shinobi could react, the shield-like structure began firing off a multitude of small, bullet-like projectiles. Naruto found his hand instinctively rising to cast off the projectiles like normal, but he was suddenly halted, as if something was tying his arm down. When he looked down, he was shocked to see a small chakra thread connected to his wrist, preventing it from moving. He frowned at the attempt to prevent his defense before his eyes pulsed with chakra, halting the potentially lethal and no doubt poisoned sand in its tracks as it met an invisible barrier of gravitational force surrounding his entire body. As quickly as it stopped, the sand, every last grain, was blasted back, scattering it in all directions throughout the clearing like shrapnel from a bomb with Naruto at its epicenter. Sasori was unconcerned though as the Kazekage quickly moved in front of him, halting the sand again as it was brought back under the puppet's magnetic influence. With every technique, every move, my fascination with you grows more and more. Come, show me just what those eyes are capable of. Naruto took a deep calming breath before raising a hand up, intent on finishing this encounter swiftly so he could go and help his friends. He trusted them, but if Sasori's partner was just as powerful as he was, then a confrontation might end with casualties. Banshu Tenon, the Kazekage puppet suddenly twitched as Sasori frowned, fingers moving in a blur as the cage was suddenly pulled in two opposite directions. Sasori kept it tethered against the increasing gravitational forces via the chakra threads all across its body. However, as strong as they were no match for a primal force of the universe, and he felt his control slip every second. Instead of struggling though, Sasori simply allowed the puppet to be pulled in, both of its arms suddenly producing long and vicious-looking scythe blades, dripping with poison. Naruto didn't let them touch him though, as with his other hand he brought his shakuju up, twirling it once before mercilessly it into the puppet's sea. The Kazekage tried to defend itself by the supposedly wooden staff into thirds, however it wasn't expecting the blades to simply bounce off the wood like it was chakra-reinforced steel. The end of the staff met its sea, and with one violent shake its connection to Sasori was blocked, allowing it to limply slump to the ground. In a smooth motion, a simple black rod emerged from Naruto's sleeve, which he quickly used to impale the puppet through the sea, pinning it to the ground and permanently disrupting its chakra. Normally I would be upset that my favorite puppet was damaged, however I feel you will be more than enough compensation for it. Naruto grimaced as he stood back up, keeping an eye on Sasori wearily. All this talk of turning him into a puppet was becoming disconcerting. In any case, Sasori was see off as both puppeteer and monk were suddenly knocked off balance by an enormous tremor running through the ground. Before it had even stabilized, a roar that could shatter windows and deafen people split the air, making Naruto clutch his ears in pain. Both men looked around to the source of the noise, only to both frown as they saw the very distinctive white head of the Rokubi no Namakuji as it roared into the sky. Naruto frowned because he was worried about his friends. He couldn't be sure if that Bayu was still Utakata or whether it would recognize his friends as non-enemies. Sasori on the other hand. I feel this is somehow Deodara's fault. Tayuya and Haku had just finished evacuating the villages when the Rokubi itself appeared, roaring up into the sky with its strange, perforated mouth. It was an ugly creature, appearing to be an enormous white slug that was constantly dripping with mucus like a slimy snowman. Six bulbous, globular tails thrashed about as it roared its newfound freedom to the world, leveling entire buildings with single, careless swipes. One tail thrashed forward, throwing off some of its viscous, clear slime that landed close to the two. It instantly burned through the roof, walls and ground around a house, reducing it to nothing more than a slurry-filled crater. F me, that's a big slug. Haku just nodded hesitantly by Tayuya's side as he stared up at the rampaging Bayu. It didn't even seem to be aware of what was going on around it, simply writhing around and destroying everything. Where's Bug Girl? She's the Jinchuriki here. As if to answer her question, a vaguely orange blur shot past them through the air, making their clothes ruffle in the breeze before it was quickly followed by numerous white blurs. It seems she's occupied. As if to affirm Haku's statement, they spotted the bomber shoot past riding his huge clay dragon that would occasionally spit out smaller, faster dragons at the cost of a part of its tail. These seemed to act as homing missiles of some kind, constantly on Fu's tail as she ducked and weaved through streets trying to shake him off. Unfortunately for her, her shadow clones could not manage partial transformations like she could, as they only contained Chomai's chakra, not her will, and quickly lost control of the forms, dispelling themselves, making them useless as distractions. Wait, are you saying that we're the ones that have to face that thing? Haku nodded grimly as he looked up at the still rampaging slug. Around it was quickly dissolving as it shook off more and more of its acidic slime. At least until Fu or Naruto can help us. Tayuya groaned before taking a calming breath, then another, and another. Watch out. The redhead was suddenly tackled to the side by Haku, her eyes wide before they narrowed angrily. The F you doing, femme? She trailed off though when she spotted the smoking, dissolving crater where she had just been standing. She looked up at Haku with wide eyes, her cheeks turning a pale shade of red as the ice user looked back down at her, suddenly realizing the slightly compromising position they were in with him straddling her. Haku, you, a near-splitting roar knocked them out of their stupor as they both winced in sync, Haku quickly rolling off the redhead. Alright, the Bayu. Haku just nodded quickly, seeming a little flustered as the two dashed off towards the rampaging creature. Fu tucked her wings in and rolled through another tight corner and under an archway in her seemingly endless weave through the village. Not only was she having to keep ahead of the annoyingly fast clay dragons that would explode if they got too close to her, she was now forced to dodge in and out of the random splashes of the Rokubi's corrosive slime. Her only break was the fact that the dragons were no more immune to it than she was, and already more than a few had been taken out by the clear, but lethal mucus. Some other she had managed to make crash into things in her complicated and reckless flight through the village. However, Deodara never seemed to run out of them, and she couldn't look back to see how many more the larger Shisu dragon could make. She grimaced as she suddenly flew up, her wings beating in overtime for the sudden lift. She knew she would have to do something unwholesomely stupid in order to shake the homing missiles off her tail. She did just that as she performed a shudderingly fast and sudden U-turn mid-air, shooting straight back towards the little dragons and trying to pick up as much speed as she could. Just as she reached the first one, which looked to be reaching out to grab her, she tucked in, folding her wings around herself as she spun through the air, twisting like a human drill. Deodara grinned widely as he saw the girl fly straight into his cloud of missiles, watching them light up and explode one after another, bathing the sky in fire and smoke. However, his hands began to tremble in rage when that same spinning drill re-emerged from the smoke, a scowl sliding across his face. Fu stopped, allowing her blackened and slightly torn wings to unfurl. She hadn't come out of that maneuver unharmed. Her skin was singed in places and reddened from the heat in others, but she was alive, and most of the Shisu dragons were taken care of. The only one remained was the original that Deodara was riding. She knew just the way to defeat it too. Deodara had also decided to take advantage of the lull in combat, calming his irritation at the girl's survival as he willed his dragon to fly forward. He would bathe this girl's last moments in his art if it was the last thing he did. Even Itachi didn't cross his mind at this point. He wanted nothing more than to see this Jinchuriki vanish into flame and smoke. Fu ran through hand seals as fast as she could before throwing her hands out, feeling as the water in the air condensed in front of her to form a perfectly flat, round mirror. Suten, Mizukigami no Jutsu. Deodara only saw the reflection of his dragon in the mirror before Fu turned the floating water circle 90 degrees. Instantly an exact copy of the dragon, even complete with a duplicate him riding on top, emerged from it. There was too little distance between them though for Deodara to turn away before the two collided. The explosion briefly matched the brightness of the sun as even the Rokubi turned its head to look at it. The resulting shockwave collapsed the nearby buildings and almost blew Haku and Tayuya off their feet as they ran. Fu caught her breath as she hovered there, glad now that Naruto had seen fit for her to learn some of the Mizukage's jutsu as the strongest water type in the group that would use it. Finally the massive cloud of smoke and dust hanging in the air dispersed as a lone figure dropped out of it, into the ground viciously and creating a decent-sized crater from his fall. Hesitantly and carefully Fu flew down to where Deodara had crashed, spotting his burned, but still alive body lying at the crater's center. Pretty good for a Jinchuriki, The blonde bomber coughed, grinning madly as he tried to stand up, only to collapse back down thanks to his weak limbs. Fu was careful in approaching him as she had been tricked by clay clones before. However, when the blonde bomber showed no sign of turning white, she breathed an internal sigh of relief. But you know, I can't let you win, not without fully experiencing my art, His words were a little shaky and Fu took them as the words of a psychopath. However, she still took a step back as a manic look entered his eye. She found she couldn't move her legs fast enough as Deodara suddenly grabbed some clay from his pouch and quickly ate it, his body quickly bulging out grossly until he better resembled a large, vaguely Deodara-esque amorphous blob. Naruto stood in awe as a veritable army of puppets blocked out the sun above him. He couldn't even count them all, but considering the name of the technique there were 100. Their chakra strings were all connected to a compartment in Sasori's sea, hundreds if not thousands of the thin, almost invisible blue threads filling the air in the Akahigi, Hyaki no Suin. However, before he could even fully appreciate the magnitude of the puppet performance, a massive explosion had the surroundings shuddering from the force. For a moment Naruto's eyes widened, thinking the Rokubi had set off a Bijudama, however when he looked it was still thrashing about, parts of its body freezing at irregular intervals. That would be Deodara finishing up with one of your companions. I may disagree with his concept of art, but he is at least competent as an explosives expert. Naruto's eyes widened even further at that before coldly closing. Sasori watched on in curiosity at what he perceived as a sign of mourning. Don't weep for your friend just yet, QB Jinchuriki, our fight is not over yet. When Naruto didn't answer, Sasori's face twitched slightly. 10 of the puppets in the sky rushing down to remind the blonde their fight wasn't over just yet. However, he was not expecting for the boy to suddenly lash out, black chakra rods sliding into his hands faster than Sasori could even follow, digging each one into the sea of the puppets one by one in an intricate, almost dance-like movement before he paused, eyes still closed. This fight is over, I can't just be stalling anymore, my friends are in danger. Naruto's eyes slowly opened again. However, the previously bright, violet color to his Rinnegan had been replaced by a deep, metallic gold. Sasori made no indication he had even noticed the change that had overcome Naruto, specifically in the teen's eyes. However, seeing the blonde so easily dispatch the 10 puppets with minimalistic and efficient movements that were actually a little difficult for even the master puppeteer to follow, he realized something must have changed. He said nothing as the hundreds of chakra threads all began to move and writhe in one great, intricate and performance. All 90 of the remaining puppets out in the open flew at blinding speed towards the lone monk, their multitude of varied weapons bright to bear, each dripping with generous doses of poison that would put even a Jinchuriki down. However, even with his near-emotionless puppet body, Sasori couldn't mask his surprise when Naruto made no move to dodge or counter-attack in any way. There was a clang of metal grinding against metal as swords, staffs, axes, halberds, and many other weapons collided with Naruto's skin, none of them even making a scratch against the Asura Path's defense, empowered as it was by Senjutsu. Naruto looked up, his gleaming golden eyes locking with Sasori's for a moment so he could see that his opponent understood just how easy it was to ignore those attacks before slowly, almost languidly closing his eyes. Sasori realized too late what was about to happen as chakra threads moved in a frenzy to pull back the multitude of puppets crowding the blonde. However, there was no distance they could have gone to protect themselves as Naruto's eyes suddenly snapped open, the darker golden ring surrounding his pupil bulging ever so slightly. A wall of force so strong that it was actually visible, thanks to the air it was displacing as it moved, through the army of puppets. Left and right the marionette army was crushed, thrown back or simply rent apart by the destructive gravitational forces that passed through them. Naruto hadn't even had to call out the name of the technique. I see you were holding back on me, Kyuubi Jinchuriki. I feel insulted, although you having the ability of senjutsu at such a young age is rather incredible. Do you think you would retain that ability as a puppet? I hope so myself. This time Naruto felt nonplussed as Sasori casually discussed his posthumous puppetification. He was still not used, nor did he think he ever would be, to the sheer power he felt as the raw element of nature flowed through his body, strengthening it and enhancing his senses. Sasori, seeing his psychological games were no longer having any effect, hardened his features until they were nothing but a cold, calculating mask. Very well, the destruction of a few puppets is acceptable, they can be rebuilt. Do you want to see just how many I have? How many lives have fallen at my feet only to be honored by their immortalization? Naruto just continued to walk forward towards him, absently sliding a chakra rod out of his sleeve to a still twitching puppet lying broken on the ground, never once taking his eyes off the red-headed puppeteer. Don't think this battle is over thanks to a slight power boost, Kyuubi Jinchuriki, you still have yet to face myself. Sasori brought his hands as he jumped back, large propeller-like blades sprouting from his back that whirred to life, carrying up and away from Naruto. The blonde broke into a sprint as compartments in Sasori's palms opened up, revealing two gleaming pipes that wasted no time in rotating suddenly. An intense roar burst from the pipes as white-hot flames, condensed into a concentrated and focused stream, burned through the air at Naruto. However, with nature chakra flowing in harmony through his body, it was as if time was slowed for the young monk. A long chakra rod the length of his body slid from his sleeve as he caught it and began spinning it in front of himself. From behind his own flames, Sasori couldn't see Naruto's right hand spring into blue flame and red burst to life in his left. Banbutsu Suzu, Shinju Kyo. The spinning form of the chakra rod suddenly merged together at the same moment the flames reached the blonde. Sasori's puppet eyes could only widen as the monk flew straight through the stream of flames that could easily melt boulders. For a moment his mind faltered as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. Unfortunately, that gave Naruto enough time to close the distance between them just as the last of the flames leaked from Sasori's handpipe. While the puppeteer's immortal body could feel no pain, he certainly felt the impact as Naruto brought whatever it was he had created around to crash into his stomach. However, it didn't seem to stop there, and before the red-headed Sunan fully knew what was happening, the flat, circular object had completely sawn through his stomach area. He watched, blinking in confusion as his lower half, complete with some of the prehensile cable he had wrapped up in a compartment there, stumbled a moment before falling to the ground. Naruto landed gracefully on a branch opposite him, still bearing those burning golden eyes as he watched for any signs of tricks from the master puppeteer. That was no summoning, you created something from nothing. A smile slid across the puppeteer's two shiny features as he looked down at the shining bronze mirror-like shield his upper body was laying on, pinned there to a tree by it. Such power is truly in the realm of the gods, to control a god. His eyes glazed slightly at the thought of the power he could wield at his fingertips as Naruto closed the distance between them cautiously, wary for any tricks the living puppet might have. Naruto had barely begun to talk before both combatants blinked, noticing an increasingly large shadow appeared above both their forms. Even Sasori's supposedly inanimate eyes widened in shock as they both looked up. Fu stared up at the sky dazedly, uncomprehending of what was going on around her. There were people, maybe people she knew. She couldn't tell, their forms were blurry and inconsistent, and her mind kept slipping when she tried to think of the names. There was a ringing in her ears, it was so loud and all-encompassing she just couldn't focus on anything else. Was she That didn't sound right. No, she still had something to do, didn't she? What was that? What was it she still had to do? Why couldn't she remember? What was with this annoying ringing that blocked out all other sounds? She blinked slowly again, rolling her head as the whisper of a word made it through the buzzing in her ears. Buzzing? Why did that sound familiar? Something to do with bugs, right? What was that sound they kept making as she lay there? Was it important? Fu. That's right, her name, it was Fu, such a strange name. Fu. More of a syllable than a word really. Was it just her, or was the ringing getting quieter? Oi fu. Reality crashed back down on the mint-haired girl as she sat upright suddenly, her orange eyes wide with shock as she panted heavily. She immediately noticed Haku kneeling next to her, hand glowing with a calming, soothing green light. She realized why when she took stock of the state her body was in. Burns littered her body like her skin was trying out a new color. Her clothing was in tatters and it seemed that the only thing protecting her modesty, what little of it she had in any case, was Haku's kimono top. She had never really noticed how toned the dark-haired Yuki was before. Oi! Eyes up, Minty. Fu shook her head as Tayuya's voice snapped her back to reality again, a faint tint of red entering her cheeks for a moment. I apologize, it appears I might have a concussion. Haku just nodded, trying to ignore the way Fu's eyes had roamed his bare sea for now. He got enough of that when Tayuya thought he couldn't see her. Luckily that's the worst you got, the burns are only minor and should be healed easily, especially if Naruto does it. It seems your wings took the brunt of the explosion. Sure enough, when Fu looked to her side she saw the charred, blackened remains of her wings lying limply beside her. With a blink she realized that could have been her. She frowned at that, she had nearly fighting that bomber. If that hadn't been a move of some kind then he would have won. She would have been in no condition to defend against him. Are you okay? She looked up again, realizing she had been quiet for a little too long. Haku was right to be worried though, she had just had a concussion after all. However, she was just as competent a medic, she knew when she was or was not at 100%. She wasn't, but that was besides the point, she knew she didn't really have a concussion. If you are here, she trailed off as she shakily got to her feet, Haku on hand in case she fell, however she managed it on her own. Does that mean the Rokubi is? He trailed off again, noting the distinct lack of a massive, rampaging slug in the near vicinity. However, there was a rather suspicious trail of mass destruction heading off in the direction of the forest, more specifically in Naruto's direction. Tayuya and Haku just widened their eyes in realization as they too looked around. Well, we saw you get hit by that explosion. Haku seemed very confused by the lack of the Bayu, his face almost perfectly mirrored by Tayuya as they both stared uncomprehendingly at the place it should have been. It was right there a moment ago. If it had been any other situation Fu might have chuckled at the expression on the redhead's face, however right now laughing would only exacerbate her own wounds. Did you two seriously just lose a Bayu? There was a moment of silence before both teens dropped their heads slightly, another comical sight for another time. Naruto dived back just in time to watch as an enormous, slimy white tail crashed down where he had just been standing, easily tearing through trees as large globs of slime began melting the surroundings. Looking up, his golden eyes could only widen at the sight of the Rokubi itself rising up above them, blocking out the light of the sun with its enormous body. Its chakra presence was just immense, standing near it was like having a weight thrown onto his shoulders. It was unlike in his seal where some of the Bijuu's chakra was filtered away by the bars, out here it was the real thing. However, in his awe at the beast he nearly allowed himself to get caught as Sasori went on the attack again. He shifted his body to the side as the thick, rasping, prehensile cable that was sharpened to a fine point at one end shot past him. It too glistened with viscous, purple poison and Naruto knew that even a graze from that weapon could be lethal and the file-like texture ensures it would easily shear through skin. He had a lot of trust in his Asura Path's defense, but using it dulled his senses, otherwise there should have been no way a Bayu could have caught him off guard like that. Granted, it had always kind of been there in the periphery of his senses so he had mostly paid it no mind, but it had nearly cost him. Matatabi had told him that Saiken's slime could even corrode the skin of the other Bayu. Not that getting close enough to them for that to work would be easy, but it was still an impressive feat. One he would not like to put his reinforced skin up against if he could avoid it. He span as the thick cable shot back around, trying to loop around him and constrict their air from his lungs. However, his eyes pulsed with chakra, halting the cable from coming closer than 2 meters for the single second it took him to jump up and away, just as the Rokubi attempted to crush him with another of its tails. It seemed like the overwhelming chakra he had racing through his system was acting like a beacon for the great slug, calling out to it like a sign pointing right at the blonde. Not only that, but when he looked over he was shocked to see Sasori had somehow gained full use of his body back. When he glanced over at where his shield was still buried halfway into the tree he saw that the bisected remains of Sasori's body was still there, however the C-cylinder containing his chakra system was not, meaning he had somehow moved it. This is useless Kyuubi Jinchuriki, you cannot possibly hope to fight both me and the fourth strongest Bayu at the same time. Even with your sage mode, it is too much for a mere teen. Naruto merely narrowed his eyes before taking a long, calming breath in the lull between the Rokubi's attacks, actually feeling as one great, long tail was lifted high into the air, casting the area around Naruto into shadow. Sasori's puppet eyebrow quirked only momentarily as he felt the enormous chakra building up inside of Naruto, for what he couldn't say but considering what the boy possessed it couldn't be good. Gedu, Kusari. Suddenly, and almost without warning, huge great chains, the thickness of Naruto himself, burst from the ground around the blonde, each a deep, obsidian black and tipped with vicious, barbed tips. They flew up into the air like enormous pythons, encircling the Rokubi in great, sweeping motions as it seemed to be encapsulated in some strange, rotating cage. Then, all of a sudden, they constricted, sweeping into tighten around Saiken and locking together at the tips above his head. If Sasori was still human, he would have gulped in shock as he stared up at the Bayu, completely suppressed like Naruto was simply training some common pet. Impossible, this power, it is on the scale of Hashirama Senju. For the first time in the many years since Sasori had abandoned his home and his family as a new nin, he took a step back in fear. So lost in his shock was he that he never noticed the single, smaller chain that slowly crept from the ground behind him, lunging forward to skewer him straight through the sea cavity, missing the last of his living flesh by only centimeters. His face was frozen into an expression of shock and fear as the chakra chain disrupted the control he had over his own body. Chakra threads from the living core uselessly flailed about, unable to do anything as control over the puppet body was wrenched from it. It's over. Naruto walked slowly over to the frozen puppeteer, his eyes still burning with chakra. Sasori found his own eyes frozen on those glowing amber orbs, ringed like ripples in a lake of molten gold. With his own chakra now in full control of Sasori's body, he brought the chain around and Sasori was able to spot that it had emerged from Naruto's sleeve, like his other chakra rods. Seeing that there were no more traps, no more tricks and nothing else Sasori could do, the blonde gave the puppeteer back his control over his head. Why? The first thing Sasori did was blink as he asked the question at the forefront of his mind. Naruto merely tilted his head in confusion. You could have pierced me directly through my core, you knew that would kill me, so why didn't you? His voice seemed genuinely confused, as much as that could convey through his near emotionless facade. Because I didn't have to. Sasori's eyes narrowed, taking that as an insult, as if Naruto could deal with him so easily he didn't even warrant K. You a naive boy. You think this ability to stay your hand from B is noble. It is only foolish to leave your enemies in a position to s your back. Naruto's eyes crinkled slightly in amusement as the chain lifted slightly, bringing the puppet closer to him. It doesn't seem like you are in a position to s anybody right now. Sasori grimaced. Right now, it was true, the only thing he could even move of his body was his head, and for some reason he couldn't eject his core to attempt to find another body. Then what? You will leave me alive, unable to move anything other than my head like some pitiful invalid. His eyes narrowed spitefully at the thought, his immortality would come as more of a curse if that was the case. I would rather s. Naruto's eyes lost their humor, startling the puppeteer as the previously warm golden eyes became colder, steelier. Don't be so quick to throw away your own life, even as perverse as you have made it. A small sigh was hidden from the blonde's lips as he finally sensed his friends, feeling the warm relief rush through him at their familiar chakra signatures, still burning strong. He had been unbelievably worried when the Rokubi had appeared. He thought his friends might have been killed by the rampaging Bayu. Anyway, I still haven't decided on what to do with you. Sasori scowled, gone now with the pretense of his emotionless mask. After all, he could only move his face, he might as well use that to the fullest extent he could. My life in the hands of a mere boy no more than 16, disgraceful. What do you want then? Information, I assume. I was the spy master for the Akatsuki after all. Naruto quirked an eyebrow, the chains binding down the Rokubi tightening slightly as he felt the beast try to escape. You gave away that information rather quickly. Sasori just maintained his frown, however his glassy eyes had a hint of defeat in them. The puppeteer knew full well what happened next was up to the monk before him. It was that, or he could hope his idiot of a partner managed to escape and was actually foolish enough to try and rescue him. Either way, his life was in the hands of a blonde. What is the point of concealing it when these might be my last words? Naruto frowned at that. Even in his enemies it was unpleasant seeing such an air of hopelessness befall anybody. I already told you that I hadn't decided to do anything yet. Sasori actually managed to quirk the edges of his smooth lips up in amusement, a hollow, humorless smile that was void of any warmth. You really are naive, aren't we? Naruto and Sasori's eyes widened at the exact same moment as a light whistling entered both their ears. With his enhanced senses, Naruto was able to spin, catching the kunai flying through the air towards them by the handle. However, too late he realized it was a distraction, the tag on the kunai already burning up. He threw it too late, the blinding light of a flash tag forcing him to close his eyes for just a second. It was enough though, he heard a dull thud, and when he opened his eyes again Sasori's face was forever locked in a visage of reassignment, glassy eyes looking forward lifelessly as a kunai stuck out of his core. Naruto's eyes widened as he looked down at the bee on his hands and robes. He had sensed it for just a fraction of a moment. A single presence, right at the edge of his Sage Mode sensory range that had appeared and disappeared in a mere flicker. The chain holding up Sasori's lifeless body disintegrated in his surprise, allowing the puppet to fall with a crunch to the floor, already littered with the shattered remains of the man's collection, just another body among 100. Naruto looked down at it, still shocked by the man's sudden death by the unknown assailant. However, Sasori could only stare up at the sky, unblinking, his dreams of immortality now forever out of his grasp. Another blonde watched the entire encounter with a frown, cradling his broken arm as he viewed monk and puppeteer alike from a very safe distance in the trees, using his eyepiece to enhance his view. He had arrived just as Naruto restrained the Bayou, a feat he was still in shock over. He had seen only one other man wield that kind of power with such ease, and the thought of there being two of them was simply frightening. He thought that Itachi was his main rival, only because when compared to people like that Itachi only scratched their league. Oh man, I never thought Sasori Dana would be the one to go, I wonder who threw that kunai. He hadn't sensed anybody nearby when the simple weapon was thrown, and it had managed to sneak past the senses of the monk, who seemed to be in some kind of enhanced state. That would be me. Deodara's eyes widened at the new voice, whirling around to defend himself. However, he only caught a flash of orange before he felt his whole world twist and contort as if his vision was being wrung out by some large, invisible hands. Then, darkness. Once Naruto was sure the attacker was not going to strike again, he had realized the assailant had been after Sasori all along and not him. He allowed a small smile to work its way onto his face as he turned to see his friends walk into the clearing. Or in Fu's case, stumble. He worried for a moment as he looked over the mint-haired girl's state, but he almost chuckled as they all gaped at the Rokubi, still tied roughly to the ground by looping and overlapping black chains, each linked the same size they were. It too turned to look at the newcomers, roaring loudly at them in its strange, high-pitched and garbled way, as if it were trying to speak through water. Setting his features, Naruto walked out in front of the beast, throwing a comforting wave towards his friends as he moved to stand in front of the Bayou, his eyes still burning golden with nature chakra. He had found, interestingly enough, that he could maintain Sage Mode for an incredible amount of time. Once he had actually made the link with nature itself, he could continuously draw in its chakra through his Preta path. The only problem was that after a certain amount of time, around 15 minutes, it began to get exhausting to maintain. He could go longer, but the strain it put on his body probably wasn't worth it. Seiken. He had hoped the Rokubi might respond to its name in some way. However, when he looked up at those twitching, stork-like antennae, he saw no recognition, or even anything to suggest intelligence behind all that rage and power. He frowned slightly. This wasn't right. The Bayou were all intelligent to a varied degree, they were all thinking, living beings. Seiken. His voice, enhanced by chakra, finally managed to catch the great slug's attention, however not in a good way. It wormed and wreathed in its bonds as it turned to face the young monk, suddenly throwing its bulbous head up into the air. Get back. Naruto quickly realized just what was about to happen as black and white balls of almost liquid chakra began to be drawn from the air, collecting above the Rokubi's perforated mouth. They all drew together until a large, pulsating ball of dark chakra hung in the air above the Bayou, practically glowing with sheer energy. The Rokubi couldn't actually reach up to swallow the dense imari, so it did the next best thing, throwing its head forward as it launched one of the most powerful attacks known to shinobi right at the group of teens. Shinra Tensei. Naruto threw both his hands up as a wave of explosive gravitational forces crashed forward from his body, quickly meeting the uncompressed Bijudama. However, to his shock, his Deva Path's attack only halted the Imari, it didn't deflect it like he hoped. Already he could see it was beginning to become unstable after being out of the Rokubi's control for so long. If it exploded here, then the compressed energies contained within would level this entire clearing, plus a great deal of land around it. Without even thinking, the blonde suddenly rushed forward, throwing his arms out wide as a determined look passed through his golden eyes. SENPOU, GAKIDOU. A corona of bright blue light expanded out from him just as the Bijudama finally destabilized, bathing the clearing in a veil of bite. Blinding light for a moment before it was all seemingly sucked away. Naruto stood right at the epicenter, clenching his teeth as bit by bit, all the chakra from the Imari drained into his body. His arms trembled, trying to stay as still as possible, as he was forced to not only draw in the extra chakra, but balance it with the senjutsu already in his body. Finally, with a grunt of exertion, the last of the attack faded from view, allowing Naruto to fall forward onto his knees, the gold finally fading from his eyes as exhaustion caught up with him. Naruto. He found Fu by his side not even a moment later, stopping him from falling face first to the ground. He chuckled to himself. Typical. Despite being gravely injured herself, Fu cast aside her own concerns to see if he was okay, and he was just lying here helplessly. He grimaced as he forced himself back to his feet, masking just how heavy his body felt at that moment. I'm fine. He took a step forward, and when he was confident he wouldn't stumble, another, and another, until he was standing in front of the Rokubi again. Seiken. Once again he received nothing but a roar of rage and anger as a response. However, he had tightened the chains immensely around the beast. He wouldn't let it form another Bijudama this time. He wouldn't have time to gather enough nature chakra to absorb it. Is Utakata okay? Fu was beside him again, looking up at the face of the Bayou impassively, although Naruto could tell standing in front of its overwhelming presence was taking its toll on her, as evidenced by the light sheen of sweat on her forehead. However, Naruto could only look down in sadness with his fist lightly clenched and trembling. Utakata is gone, I can't even feel his chakra anymore. When the Rokubi broke free, it tore his body apart. Fuu's eyes widened marginally before she too looked down, a troubled expression breaking through her mask as she allowed herself to briefly mourn the loss of a Jinchuriki like them. So what are you going to do? Absorb it? Naruto frowned. He hated that with every encounter with a Bayou he ended up taking it into himself. This was not what he had intended. He had wanted to help the Bayou, not seal them within himself. However, at the same time he knew leaving it free, especially in the state of mind it was in now, would only lead others to seal it, and then they would simply face the same problem with the Akatsuki. However, he lacked the sealing ability to place the Bayou into anything other than himself, Fu, or the Kohaku no Johei. Fu would burn up with two of the chakra creatures inside of her, and the Kohaku no Johei was a temporary solution at best. The artifact wouldn't hold chakra of that magnitude for long, as the repeated sealing of the Hachibi had shown. That only left himself as a viable option. Stealing his gaze, he looked up at Seiken last time as the chains binding it began to glow an ethereal blue. I don't know if you understand me right now, but I'm sorry for this. Why won't you tell me anything? Naruto had actually raised his voice as he stood at the center of the mighty room that was made up of the Bijuu's individual cages. He had come into the seal shortly after fully assimilating the Rokubi, firstly to fix the internal damage that it was sure to cause. He was lucky though that it had been almost 3 years since he had sealed the Gobi, that had given his body plenty of time to adjust, so the transfer itself went almost as smoothly as when he had first absorbed Shukaku. It helped he went much slower as well. Secondly, he wanted to know something from his tenants, something that had been niggling at his mind ever since seeing Seiken rampage in his fight with Sasori. The Rokubi itself seemed to be unconscious through all of this, seemingly having been pacified by his chains to the point where it had practically melted into a white puddle in its cage next to the Kyuubi's. So instead he was asking the rest of his tenants, however they weren't very forthcoming with the answers he wanted. He wouldn't quite say he was demanding them, but he was insisting rather strongly. It is not quite so simple, Ninjin. Isabu, oddly enough, was the first to speak to him. 3 years doing a lot to proverbially, and literally, bring her out of her shell. He looked around at her, but that was when the confidence seemingly left her and she became quiet. I just want to understand, what was wrong with Seiken out there? Why didn't he seem to recognize his own name? Some of the Bayou, like Matatabi and Kokuo, looked down at that while the Kyuubi simply huffed from its cage, turning disinterestedly away from the conversation. Naruto already knew the fox wouldn't answer his questions. You demand a lot from us, ninja. This time it was Son Goku who spoke. However, when Naruto looked around, he did not shy away. We do not need to explain to you why we do things, we simply are. Naruto sighed in frustration as he leant on his shakuju, the events from the day beginning to really catch up to him. Can you at least tell me why you do not wish me to know? Again the room was silent as the Bayou simply stared at him. With one last sigh, Naruto just nodded concedingly. He could always come back and try again when he was less tired. For now he needed to go back and finish healing Fu. Very well, I will come back once Saiken has woken up. I'm sure he will have questions. With that he simply faded from view, as if he had never been there at all. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.